The story of tensions between Russia and the US surrounding the war in Ukraine has entered a new chapter, as tough statements have been issued from both sides. But the reality on the battlefield and at the negotiating table shows a completely different picture. US President Donald Trump, via the social media platform Truth Social, delivered a message described as an ultimatum to Russia. Moscow has 50 days to sign a peace agreement to end the conflict in Ukraine, or it will face tariffs of up to 100% and extremely severe economic sanctions from the US. It seems that this threat would create a seismic shock on the European geopolitical chessboard, but the reaction from Russia was completely the opposite. The Kremlin, through spokesperson Dmitry Peskov, quickly refuted it, emphasizing that the message does not contain any significant new elements and is essentially a political stunt, nothing more, nothing less. According to Peskov, what Trump presented was actually a repetition of statements and measures that the US has applied to Russia many times in the past, and there is nothing strong enough to exert real pressure forcing Moscow to change its stance. Not only Peskov, but other senior figures in the Russian government, such as former President Dmitry Medvedev and Deputy Foreign Minister Sergey Ryabkov, also did not hesitate to criticize this ultimatum. They called it a move to gain favor in the US, a domestic political ploy, rather than a serious diplomatic signal. According to them, this may just be part of an election strategy to attract the attention of American voters, rather than a genuine effort to resolve the deadlock in Ukraine. Some officials even sarcastically remarked that such threats have become boring and no longer concern Moscow. The strong and somewhat dismissive reaction from Russia is not without basis. Despite ultimatums and sanctions imposed by the US and Western allies, the conflict in Ukraine has not cooled down, but shows signs of escalating more intensely. In May 2025 alone, Russia carried out a series of large-scale attacks using drones, UAVs, and missiles on several key Ukrainian cities, such as Kiev, Kharkiv, Kryvyi Rih, and Vinnytsia. The peak was on May 18, 2025, when Moscow launched the largest UAV attack since the conflict began, with a total of 273 drones launched at the Kiev, Dnipropetrovsk, and Donetsk areas. The consequence of this attack was severe destruction of many residential areas, heavy damage to infrastructure systems, and numerous civilian casualties and injuries. Not long before that, on February 23, 2025, Russia also set another record by using 267 UAVs in a single attack, putting immense pressure on Ukraine's air defense system. Such continuous and increasingly large-scale attacks have sent a clearer message than any diplomatic statement. Russia has no intention of stopping, despite ultimatums, threats of sanctions, or pressure from the US and NATO. In fact, Moscow's actions show that they are choosing to respond with military force, rather than conceding or seeking peace on terms set by the West. Meanwhile, in the United States and many European countries, public opinion remains deeply divided on how to deal with Russia. Some opinions hold that the current sanctions and economic isolation measures are not strong enough to force Russia to de-escalate. However, there are also views that these measures will, in the long run, harm the global economy, as well as negatively affect the lives of people in the Western countries themselves. The 50-day ultimatum event by Mr. Trump has thus become the focal point of attention, not only in the media, but also in political debates across the Atlantic. However, as many experts have noted, this ultimatum is largely symbolic and serves internal U.S. political objectives, rather than having a substantial impact on the military situation in Eastern Europe. Russian leaders understand this well, and their reaction is a blunt denial, even somewhat contemptuous, considering it merely a repetition of old tricks that the West has used against Russia in the past. Russia has also not hesitated to continue military actions in Ukraine. Drone and missile attacks on cities such as Kharkiv, Kryvyi Rih, and Vinnytsia occurred almost simultaneously with the issuance of the ultimatum, further reinforcing the argument that Moscow is not influenced by any external diplomatic or economic pressures. On the contrary, The Putin administration seems to want to demonstrate that they remain in control of the situation and can increase pressure on Ukraine at any time. This poses a major challenge to U.S. strategies, especially as the country's elections are approaching and foreign affairs are increasingly becoming a heated topic of debate. In the eyes of many American voters, resolving the conflict in Ukraine is a test of the president's credibility and leadership ability. But at the same time, it is also a difficult calculation of the costs, benefits, and risks that the United States must face. After more than 2 years of prolonged war, Ukraine has had to brace itself against a relentless wave of attacks from Russia. Military, financial, and diplomatic support from the West, although very important, is still not enough to help Kiev completely reverse the situation. Each time Russia increases UAV attacks, like the 2 recent record-breaking waves, Ukraine's air defense system is pushed to its limits, while the people continue to endure irreparable losses. In that context, Trump's ultimatum, which was expected to create a turning point, instead became a starting shot for new debates, but lacked the weight to force Russia to change its stance or end the conflict. On the contrary, it highlighted the limitations of such pressure measures against an opponent like Moscow, which is already too familiar with rounds of sanctions, isolation, and threats from the West. Looking more broadly, Russia's reaction also reflects the reality that the situation of the conflict in Ukraine is becoming increasingly complex and unpredictable. The latest developments show that neither side is ready to sit at the negotiating table with any substantial concessions, while traditional diplomatic measures, including the strongest ultimatums, are also insufficient to change the balance of power on the battlefield. The question now is, will the U.S. and its allies continue to persist with sanctions, or will they have to seek a more effective strategy? And will Russia continue its path of confrontation, regardless of all consequences, to achieve its goals in Ukraine? The reality shows that, at least for the time being, the war shows no signs of cooling down, and external pressure measures are still not strong enough to force Moscow to change its calculations. Meanwhile, the people of Ukraine continue to face danger, loss, and uncertainty about the future every day. Each wave of drone and missile attacks causes many families to lose their homes, children to be evacuated, and hospitals and schools to be destroyed. Behind the statistics on the number of UAVs and missiles launched, countless tragedies are silently unfolding across the country of Ukraine. In summary, Trump's 50-day ultimatum and Russia's uncompromising response have clearly exposed the limitations of tough diplomatic measures in the context of a conflict that has escalated to an uncontrollable level. Russia flatly rejected the ultimatum, continuing to increase military activities in Ukraine, clearly demonstrating a defiant attitude in the face of pressure from the U.S. and the West. This is not only a test for the Trump administration, but also a warning about the complexity and persistence of the Ukraine conflict, where peace still seems to be a distant goal, despite all efforts and declarations from international powers.